Again, Zelensky finds himself between a rock and a hard place. He's got to answer to his own constituents, who, whilst it's true, Ukraine is getting very tired of the war. A lot of Ukrainians are willing to make some concessions and do some kind of deal to end the war. They're not prepared to forfeit their peoplehood. They're not prepared to forfeit their sovereignty, and they're certainly not prepared, to take Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump's word that this is the end of their troubles, not the beginning of the next phase of their troubles. So I think this is the kind of contradiction that we see playing out now.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've got Michael Weiss on the show. He's an investigative journalist and, of course, editor of The Insider. So just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Ready's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcast. Michael, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Pleasure, Maddie. Good to be back.
We'll have to start off with what is happening today. Now, we're not exactly privy to the exact details of Zelensky and Witkoff's 5-hour meeting that took place on Sunday in Berlin. It will, of course, continue today. What we do know is that Zelensky did offer to drop Ukraine's desire to join NATO only if they were given a strong Article 5-like security guarantee from the US, from Europe, Canada, Japan, etc. So while this is still a major concession for Ukraine to make, I mean, Putin won't accept this, I imagine. Is that your thoughts?
Yeah, and also, Zelensky sort of clarified on a WhatsApp call with Ukrainian journalists. What he said was, look, we just have to accept the reality that we're not being invited to join NATO right now. But to forswear NATO membership in perpetuity it has a constitutional matter in Ukraine. It's not something Zelensky himself can do, so there would have to be Ukrainian buy-in at the legislative level. But yes, to say that we're no longer pursuing this actively is a concession from Ukraine. Now, the question of security guarantees. I mean, look, I don't think it's too controversial or provocative to say that Donald Trump has been on a pro-Russian tilt, particularly in the last month or so. I mean, this peace process, so-called, began with a 28-point plan that really was written by the Russian side. I mean, we at The Insider had a draft of this plan as it was cobbled together by Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, 6 months ago. And that draft bore a striking resemblance to the one that was apparently, redone or revised between and amongst Dmitriev and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and so on. But it was a Russian proposal, and it's been watered down now to 20 points, thanks to the interventions of people such as Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State in Geneva, and of course the Europeans. But I don't think anybody should be under any illusions here. I mean, the only security guarantee from the United States that would be of any consequence would be American boots on the ground in Ukraine, right? That's the deterrent that the Ukrainians would be looking for. I don't see that happening under the Donald Trump administration. Frankly, I wouldn't have seen it happening under the Biden administration. But also, any promise or commitment that Trump makes at this stage to possibly militarily intervene against Russia should be taken with an entire silo of salt. I don't think the Ukrainians or the Europeans think that Donald Trump is a guy who's going to get into a shooting war with Vladimir Putin, especially now, when he's done everything he possibly can to cater to and appease Putin, right? And I think the Ukrainians are incredibly leery of any piece of paper. I mean, every time you mention security guarantees, they always cite the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which was one of the signatories on that document was the United States. Another was Russia, right, which is will protect the sovereignty and independence of the state of Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. Look what happened. So they're going to be incredibly suspicious if any piece of paper that gets signed between the Americans and the Russians on protecting what is left of sovereign Ukraine.
In order to avoid a repeat of what happened with the Budapest Memorandum, Zelensky has been saying that any sort of security commitment from the US needs to be signed and voted in through US Congress so that it's much harder to undo or abandon. It's far more credible, especially with, of course, a new administration will eventually come into a power and have to respect it. So how important do you think that it is that Zelensky does push for this?
Well, it's very clever of Zelensky to do that. I mean, that makes any agreement more treaty-like by the United States and therefore more binding, and also Congress is far more pro-Ukraine than the White House, and that includes Republicans in Congress, particularly in the Senate. Just a little bit of inside baseball, because we like to talk about sort of the United States as this monolith trying to ram down this agreement with the Ukrainians, but there's quite a lot happening on the American side, which, I mean, I'm sort of reluctant to say this, but it's almost like American Kremlinology, sort of who's up, who's down, which factions are attempting to do what here. And, the congressional element is important. So within the last fortnight, the White House released its national security strategy, which was met with gasps of horror by mostly Europeans, but also by Ukrainians, because what it did was essentially say that Europe, the European Union in particular, was seen as enemy terrain by the United States, and the U.S. should cultivate resistance to the current European political trajectory, which is to say back parties like AfD, populist far-right parties, and people who want to exit the European Union. This was a sort of a neutron bomb dropped on 80 years of Pax Americana and the transatlantic relationship. Congress is also very, very upset by this national security strategy, and you know that because the Senate released a draft and then just voted on it, the National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year of 2026. And in this act, there is a commitment of $400 million of aid to Ukraine per year through the USAI program, which was one of the Biden holdover programs for security assistance. But there's also a lot of other things. Trump cannot withdraw troops from Europe without giving, for more than, I think, 60 or 90 days without giving notice to Congress. There's an incredible amount of congressional oversight over all the things that would worry both NATO and Ukraine, right? Now, these provisions were written essentially as a block, or perhaps a straitjacket, I should say, on Donald Trump and some of the more isolationist elements within his administration. So the Ukrainians are watching this all transpire with a sort of a keen political instinct. Who on the American side is with us? Who is looking to sort of sell us out, right? So to go to Congress in the U.S., I think is a smart move. And also the Ukrainians are calculating, well, I mean, there's at least a fair chance Donald Trump will not be president at the end of his term. And yet a lot of the members in Congress will continue to hold legislative positions. So it's good to cultivate them now and to get their sort of buy-in on any agreement, because, the Ukrainians will be dealing with them after Donald Trump is gone.
So the talks will continue today. Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, they're in Berlin to continue these talks with Germany and with Ukraine. Today we'll focus on these security guarantees as you and I have discussed what the US can provide to Ukraine. But we know that territorial concessions are a red line for Ukraine. But we also know that Zelensky has said, look, he's willing to withdraw NATO, desires potentially reduce his military. That's the kind of area he can work with. But territorial concessions, red line, and he really wants security guarantees from the US side. Do you think Witkoff and Kushner will respect these wishes from the Ukrainian side and commit to any security guarantees today?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, the discussion now, the American counterproposal to this Ukrainian red line is to say, well, all right, what if you just withdraw your troops, but the Russians can't move in and take the territory in Donetsk, all right? They're calling it a free economic zone. The Russians are calling it a demilitarized zone. These are two very distinct concepts, right? The Ukrainian position is, first of all, there's 100,000 people whose lives are at stake in the territory in Donetsk that Ukraine currently holds. This is probably the most fortified strip of territory in all of Europe, right? It's a collection of citadel towns and cities which have been built up since 2014, basically to keep the Russians from getting within striking distance of other oblasts, including Kharkiv and then eventually, Kyiv. The Ukrainians do not think that the Russians are going to stop in Donbass. They think that the Russians want all of Ukraine, and this would only give them, put them that much closer to achieving that ultimate strategic objective. There's also a logistical challenge of withdrawing Ukrainian forces and, as I say, 100,000 people from this area. This is not, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, I mean, they're real estate developers, and they see everything in terms of transaction and barter. Oh well, here's a little strip of territory. What if we give you X number of square kilometers here, and you give us X number of square? For them, the concept of political reality or just day-to-day life that is affected by war and occupation, it doesn't factor. They cannot countenance these things, right? So the Ukrainians are deeply frustrated that they're dealing with people who see this as some kind of boardroom negotiation and not as a matter of statecraft and human rights. In terms of what the Russians are willing to accept, I mean, again, it pays to remember, we are only talking about negotiations that are taking place amongst three parties: the Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans. Now, the Russians today said, and I'm quoting an article in the Wall Street Journal, that any attempt by Brussels to water down that original 28-point proposal will be met, with sort of furrowed brows and a great deal of resistance, which is itself another kind of admission that the 28-point proposal was written by the Russian side. They saw this as a starting point for them. So I think, the Americans need to realize that this is not as easy as sort of moving pieces around the board of Stratego, right? I mean, there's a lot at stake here. And Zelensky himself, look, it's quite interesting. One of the pro-Russian arguments that you hear a lot, I should say bits of propaganda, is that in 2019, Zelensky was elected on this mandate of ending the war. He came in perhaps a little too quixotic and naive about what he could manage to do with the Russians that his predecessor could not. And then the so-called Steinmeier formula. This is the formula that was presented by the German president at the time, to kind of freeze the conflict and almost have a kind of de facto recognition of Russian occupation. Zelensky wanted to take this to his people and sort of certify it. They said no. The Russians say that, the reason they said no is that it was the far right, the Azov element, the Nazis of Ukraine, that forced Zelensky's hand and threatened him, and therefore our peace in our time was a foregone conclusion. Well, fast forward to 2025, almost 2026. Azov is no longer a battalion, nor is it a brigade. It's a corps. And not only is it a corps, I mean, it's emerged from the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is one of the most battle-hardened and battle-capable elements in the Ukrainian military. Do you suppose these guys are going to take it on the chin now? You fought and bled and died for Donbass, including, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. These are some of the most pitched battles in the 2014-2015 period in the first Russian invasion. And now, sorry, but, we've got a strip mall developer from the Bronx and Donald Trump's son-in-law, and they say, that's very sweet of you, but, it doesn't belong to you anymore. You have to give it up. What do you think is going to happen internally in Ukraine? This is something I think, again, the lack of political imagination by the American negotiating team, or at least the vanguard of that negotiating team, is extraordinary. This is going to cause a political crisis in Ukraine. It may even lead to another revolution, if not possibly a coup. Again, Zelensky finds himself between a rock and a hard place. He's got to answer to his own constituents who, whilst it's true Ukraine is getting very tired of the war, a lot of Ukrainians are willing to make some concessions and do some kind of deal to end the war. They're not prepared to forfeit their peoplehood. They're not prepared to forfeit their sovereignty, and they're certainly not prepared, to take Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump's word that this is the end of their troubles, not the beginning of the next phase of their troubles. So I think this is the kind of contradiction that we see playing out now.
So Zelensky is copying this sudden pressure from the US side to hold a national election, while Russia has obviously always demanded this. The Ukrainian president is now saying that he's open to holding an election within the next few months, but Ukraine's constitution bans national elections while there's a war in place. So Ukraine's former Minister of Economy tweeted this. He said, Ukraine, like Great Britain in World War II, can't have elections in wartime with a foreign invader occupying 20% of the country. There won't be free elections in Russia. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on this, Michael, the fact that Ukraine has been pressured to do this?
So having elections now, I mean, this again is a Moscow conceit that is being laundered through Washington, right? Putin says Zelensky who? This is an illegitimate guy, a pretender president. He has no authority. I won't negotiate with him. Donald Trump hates Volodymyr Zelensky because in Donald Trump's mind, Zelensky is inextricably tied up with Donald Trump's first impeachment in term one. right? This attempt to shake down the Ukrainians. You need to dig up dirt on Joe Biden and his son to help me. And Ukraine said, sorry, we want no part of it. And there was a withholding of military aid to Ukraine as a result of this. And also, he just thinks of Ukraine now as an inconvenience and a distraction for making America great again and getting his Nobel Peace Prize, right? This was what meant to be the war he was going to solve in 24 hours. He claims he managed to solve 8 other conflicts or 7 other conflicts, including Gaza, which, as Vladimir Putin will tell you, that's the hardest thing. Nobody anticipated it, but you, great Donald Trump, was able to do it. So he really doesn't like Zelensky, and he's not so fond of Ukraine. But I think what Zelensky, again, rather cleverly reading the room, is doing here is saying, okay, you know what? I'll hold elections, but I have to hold them, as you pointed out, there needs to be a constitutional authorization to hold elections in a state of martial law. First of all, martial law has to be lifted. I need to go to the Rada, Ukrainian parliament. So again, Zelensky would then have to get legislative buy-in, so it's not all on him. It's on his parliament. And in order to do this, I'm going to need security guarantees, such as, that voting sites don't get blown up or bombed with Kinjals or Shahid drones, right? So what guarantees are you going to give me that we're going to be able to have a free and fair election? And then, look, there's also an internal political element at play here, too. You talk to some Ukrainians, and they say, actually, Zelensky's quite keen to do elections and to do them quickly because that will deprive the opposition, including his main rival, who polls just as well, if not better, than he does, Zaluzhny, the former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, who's now the Ukrainian ambassador to Britain. This will deprive the opposition of any time or wherewithal to get their act together and to mount a credible challenge, right? There won't be a campaign, per se, in 60 to 90 days. So perhaps Zelensky is trying to kind of rush through elections because it'll just mean, his anointment and therefore he will gain greater legitimacy in the eyes of Donald Trump. I think, though, that Zelensky is basically calling the bluff here and saying, I can't do this, but if you're really that keen on it, you're going to have to do something for me first.
That was my interpretation, that he's calling Trump's bluff. I want to get your thoughts on something, Michael. Yuri Ushakov, Putin's top foreign policy advisor, he said that Russia hasn't seen what alterations Ukraine and Europe have made to Trump's peace proposal being theirs, but they're likely to make sharp objections. So Republican Congressman Don Bacon, who's been a staunch critic of how the Trump administration are handling the situation, responded to this clip of Yuri, and he wrote that the US needs to send 200 long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine. This may help Russia negotiate with more earnestness. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, the question about Tomahawk cruise missiles, again, it's extraordinary that we find ourselves now, 6 or 7 weeks on from that meeting in the White House that didn't go catastrophically, but it didn't go well either, where Donald Trump was meant to make a decision, should he give Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. The very fact we were talking about Tomahawks for Ukraine, nobody saw this coming, right? Nobody saw Trump giving or implementing sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, the 2 energy giants in Ukraine, and also the cash cows for the regime and Putin's cronies. But, it was almost a distraction in itself. I mean, what Ukraine needs more than anything is help in sourcing its domestic arsenal of long-range missiles, including drone missiles, and now they're building ballistic missiles. We don't have enough Tomahawks to give Ukraine for those Tomahawks to matter militarily. I mean, a couple hundred of them sailing into Alabaga, which is the massive facility that Russia has built to manufacture its drones. I mean, this is one of these sort of heavily fortified complexes. It's sprawling. A couple hundred Tomahawks sailing into Alabaga would make a very poignant political message for Putin, right? That's an American munitions hitting one of the most strategic targets inside Russia. So it's not like they would be completely wasted. But again, we could not give them in enough quantities to Ukraine for them to make any sort of difference on the battlefield. It's much better to help Ukraine build up its own arsenal. So this was kind of a distraction, or a distracting conversation at the time. But the Ukrainians wanted Trump to do this again for the optics of it all. Now, I'm of the opinion in war, more is more, right? Give them Tomahawks. I thought they should have had ATACMS and HIMARS and Abrams and all the rest of it. The Pentagon likes to bean count. They like to come up with objections. I mean, I had a meeting with a White House official at the beginning of the summer counteroffensive in 2023, when things were not going well for Ukraine. And that White House official told me, look, the DOD is against four things, adamantly opposed to four things. One was Abrams tanks. The other was F-16 fighter jets. The other was ATACMS. And the other was Patriot missile air defense systems. And at the time, I pointed this out, of these four platforms, only one thing has actually been sent to Ukraine as operational, and that's the PAT, right? And this thing has shot down everything the Russians have thrown at it, including their supersonic Kinzhal missile, their Wunderwaffe. The guy said, yeah. I said, so maybe, just maybe, DOD are telling porkies because they want to hoard their goods for some confrontation, maybe in Taiwan or who knows. You ask any military expert, Abrams tanks are not going to be doing much good, jumping across an archipelago of islands in the Asia, in some kind of hypothetical conflict in Asia. So yes, we always have this problem where the American military-industrial complex doesn't want to part with their goodies. But now, Donald Trump likes to make a point of this, and he does this even when he's battering Ukraine or bullying them. He always emphasizes, we're not giving anything to the Ukrainians now. The Europeans are buying everything. And this is a mechanism that was implemented called Pearl. And it's a system by which NATO allies, but now also Australia and other countries, can simply purchase things like Patriot missiles or Gimlers for the HIMARS, the missiles or the artillery rockets that are fired from the HIMARS, purchase them from the United States with the express purpose of donating them to Ukraine. And so far, there's billions of dollars of money committed to this program. This could only grow and expand in perpetuity. It's one way to keep the lifeline going, right? Because there are certain things the Americans make that Ukraine needs that cannot be sourced elsewhere by the Europeans, including and especially long-range air defense. So the question is, when all of this process, this latest sort of fandango with the Europeans and the Americans and the Ukrainians comes to an end, and the Russians just reject this out of hand, where does that leave security assistance? Where does that leave the future of U.S.-Ukrainian relations? And that's a very touch-and-go thing, because Trump could get quite petulant and say, I'm just going to throw all my toys out the pram and just dismantle Pearl, my signature accomplishment thus far, and Ukraine gets nothing. And at this point, I talk to Ukrainians and they say, the United States has sort of got its retaliation in first. They've done all of the things that we were worried they were going to do. They've cut aid at least 3 or 4 times. They've stopped intelligence sharing. We've started to make accommodations for this, right? And the Europeans, I think, are now getting religion on the idea that maybe the United States is not going to be there, not just for Ukraine, but for ourselves in the long term. Maybe NATO is now more of a dead letter. Article 5 doesn't exist. We need to get our security act in order. So I think there's a lot happening that we're not seeing in the headlines right now, which is also important to emphasize. I know that's a long answer to a short question. I apologize, but yeah.
Well, we talk about, there's so much conversation about what are we going to do if Trump backs out of peace talks? What are we going to do if the US decides that they no longer want to be involved in these negotiations because they're not going anywhere, because Ukraine isn't conceding anything, because Russia refuses to play ball? But is there a reason to believe that perhaps Europe, NATO, Ukraine should go at this alone without Trump, without his unpredictability?
I have been saying from the moment Donald Trump was reelected, the best outcome is this. Maintain the status quo as long as you can with the Americans. Do it basically because you need to buy some time, the Europeans. Lock in place things such as Pearl, where you just... Donald Trump is a transactionally minded guy. Fine, pay for everything. He wants you to pay for it. MAGA thinks that supporting Ukraine was some kind of dodge or, exploited welfare scheme. It wasn't. The reality is most security assistance for Ukraine meant giving Ukraine hand-me-down weapons that we no longer use and investing in our own infrastructure to produce newer and better and more modernized weapons, right? Which also meant hiring more American workers. So it was an investment in our own economy to help Ukraine. But MAGA didn't see it that way. They saw it as some kind of grift. Well, that's over now, right? We don't donate anything. Europe pays the bills. Donald Trump, whether by accident or design, has squandered the leverage that he thinks he has in trying to bully Ukraine into submission or to ram some dismal peace deal in place. And I keep telling the Europeans, you suffer from a crisis of self-confidence. You've got all the resources. You've got plenty of money. Germany is now rearming at rapid pace. And I think that Chancellor Merz has been outspoken, and increasingly so, about the stark realities. He has said, just within the last 48 hours, Pax Americana is over. And by the way, we mustn't trust the Russians. Vladimir Putin is Hitler. He's not going to stop at Ukraine. We find ourselves in a kind of 1938 environment. Well, you can't take rhetoric like that back. That's very arresting, especially coming from a German chancellor. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the Europeans now stand on your own 2 feet. I don't mean that to be condescending. I mean, you hear this from Europeans too, like, oh, well, it's time that we, decouple or sort of sever our relationship with the United States. Yes, as an American, as much as it pains me to say this, and as much as this also sort of wrinkles the nostril of the remaining Atlanticists within the Republican Party, with Donald Trump in the cockpit in the United States, you cannot trust him. If something happens, if there's another war, if Russia invades, or even if they do something, using hybrid methods, a drone swarm in Lithuania to precipitate some kind of military retaliation, which then leads to something worse. Article 5 gets invoked. Is the United States sending the cavalry? Are they coming to the rescue? Do you solemnly believe that this man is going to have your back? And even if you waver on the answer to that question, you have now just answered a much larger question, which is, this is up to you. And I know the Ukrainians are very reluctant for this too. They still believe in the United States security umbrella and all the rest of it. And they'll cite things like, well, the intelligence, only the United States consorts this great satellite intelligence. But again, there is nothing to stop Europe from developing its own sovereign capabilities here. I mean, that should have started a year ago. It should have started many years ago. But now, okay, you're still reliant on the U.S. for some things. Try to maintain the relationship as best you can. And if it means paying for things that you otherwise would have got for free, fine. If it means doing things that are kind of diplomatically, I'll say, incentivizing to Donald Trump, but less diplomatically, I would say, kind of bribing him in a way. I don't mean illicitly. I mean giving him things that otherwise you would not give him. The Russians are certainly doing that with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. I mean, the Europeans have to play sort of dirty ball here. And I hope that they begin now to see that this is where things are headed, and they have been headed this way for a long time.
And if it means that they're just relying on US intelligence and that's all they get from the US, then so be it. Because if we keep that in place and the Europeans eventually do confiscate these billions of dollars worth of frozen Russian assets and use it to fund Ukraine for the next few years, then that's great. But I want to get back to these comments as a final question, Michael. Friedrich Merz, as you mentioned, that he said that Europe must take Vladimir Putin seriously, warning that his territorial ambitions do resemble Hitler in the 1930s. He argued that any appeasement would be a grave mistake and called for stronger European resolve and support for Ukraine to deter future aggression. And that has been such a comparison in the last few weeks of everyone comparing the way Putin considers his territorial gains in Ukraine to the way that Hitler orchestrated and eventually went into further expansionism into World War II. But we've seen Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff saying that they believe Putin wants peace. And I always refer back to that old saying that when someone shows you who you are, believe them. And it's so relevant to right now. So why do you think that Donald Trump doesn't believe what history is telling us and what Putin is showing him?
I'm not a psychologist, and I try not to do psychology at a distance. I think, though, that we know Donald Trump. He's been in our lives as a political actor for almost a decade. I was going to say for better or for worse, but I think I know which side of the ledger I come down on that. But I think there are certain things that we can say with a fair degree of certainty. Number one, Trump likes strong men. He likes dictators because he has a Jones for what they're able to do and what they're able to do without any kind of bureaucratic obstruction or democratic intervention. They don't get tossed from power through a free and fair election. Or if it is a free and fair election and they lose, they simply take power, which he attempted to do on January 6th. Malcolm Muggeridge, the BBC journalist, he had two friends, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who were notorious fellow travelers of Soviet communism. And they went to Moscow, came back with Muggeridge. Muggeridge, the scales had fallen from his eyes about what he'd seen about high Stalinism. And somebody asked him, how come your friends Sidney and Beatrice are so fond of Stalin? And Muggeridge replied, well, it's because Stalin is doing to intellectuals in Russia what they'd like to be doing to intellectuals in the UK, right? Don't underestimate this kind of longing for power, this longing to be able to impose your will with no oversight, with no resistance whatsoever. That very much applies to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is also, I think, deeply naive in the sense that he believes he can be best friends with Putin. As long as the policies are in place, if we can lift sanctions, if we can bring Russia back into the sort of economic the community of nations and economic stability and all the rest of it, Russia will just play nicely. Putin sees this and holds Donald Trump in contempt. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind Putin thinks Trump is an imbecile, and he thinks Trump is weak and pathetic because, Putin, like a lot of Russian dictators in the past, admire strength. It's not a coincidence that one of the strangest relationships that Putin has got is with Erdogan, the Turkish president, who, there have been times when literally, the Turks shot down a Russian jet and everyone said, ooh, this is going to be World War III because Turkey's a NATO power. And they basically just hugged it out, Russia and Turkey. Turkey has gone after Russian assets and interests, quite literally, in Libya, destroying Pantsir air defense systems, wiping out Russian material on the ground where Wagner paramilitaries were in place to back up Khalifa Haftar, the warlord who was trying to take Tripoli. And this didn't cause any real ruction in the Ankara-Moscow relationship. Why? Because when Erdogan feels that his strategic interests are at stake, and when he feels that the Russians are parking tanks on his lawn, he punches Putin in the face and draws blood, and Putin respects him for that. Donald Trump doesn't do that. He's afraid. He doesn't want to upset the Tsar. So instead, he, again, takes a 28-point peace plan done up by a Harvard and Stanford educated Russian sovereign wealth fund manager and presents it as his own. And the Russians look at this and they just think, this guy's a mug. He's pathetic. We can do anything we want with him, and they are. And it's not a coincidence that the one thing that he did that was objectively anti-Russian in this term, the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, that had come in conjunction with a package that was prepared by the Senate by Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, a bipartisan piece of legislation, which was all ready to go to impose 500% tariffs on any countries importing Russian oil, gas, uranium, petroleum products. And there had been indications by the White House that if this bill were put up to a floor vote and it passed, which it would do with an overwhelming majority, and that means the House would pass their version too, the White House would sign it into law. The Russians saw this and were absolutely terrified, so they swooped in with another kind of stalling measure, which was this peace process that's now playing out. I don't think that Putin thinks there's going to be an agreement. I don't think he's keen to have an agreement, but he is keen to take a step back, regain his bearings, catch his breath, and allow his forces to regenerate. So if anything that kind of pauses the war in that time, he's going to be sort of amenable to. He's also very keen for economic relief because the Russian economy is not doing very well, right? So anything that has a chance of lifting sanctions, that's something he's going to entertain and sort of engage with. The Americans, though, they don't have Russia subject matter specialists kind of in the room negotiating these things, right? Witkoff was literally relying on a Russian foreign ministry translator who we determined is almost certainly an SVR officer for understanding what the Russians were telling him. And is it any wonder that when he came back and told Trump, let's have a summit in Alaska, the Russians will meet you at this point, they're going to make concessions. They never agreed to make any concessions. The whole thing was based on miscommunication and witlessness. Again, for Moscow, this is a dream come true. An American regime that is made of mush.
Every time there's a Yeah, threat of sanctions. It's exactly right. They come back to the drawing board, say that they'll negotiate. It's exactly what happened in Alaska. It's exactly what's happened in the latest peace talks, as you mentioned. The last thing we heard from Lindsey Graham was about a month to 6 weeks ago, where he'd said he'd been given Trump's word that he would pass the sanctions bill once it hit his desk. So he said, look, it's going to go to a Senate vote, and then we heard nothing of it, and peace talks resumed. But Michael Weiss, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report again.
Sure, my pleasure, Maddie.